Thanks everyone who's joined us today and anyone who's watching the recording in the future. As usual, if you have any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and we'll go through them at the end. Please also ensure you're on mute unless you're asking a question. Thank you. So let's get started. So hello, I'm Sophie Thompson, co-founder and CEO of VirtualSpeech, an online platform that blends e-learning with practice exercises online and in virtual reality. I'm really excited today to be joined by John Bailey, who was recently appointed COO of Go Crisis and will be talking to us about crisis management today. Hello, John.
Hi, Sophie. Hello, everyone.
Thank you. So just to give everybody a bit of a background about you, John. So John has spent more than 30 years helping companies around the world to prepare for and respond to reputation challenges and crises. He offers an unrivaled breadth of international experience, having built the largest independently owned PR agency in Singapore and worked with more than 100 clients in over 50 countries. John has worked with over 70 clients in the airline industry and several large hotel groups, as well as companies such as IATA. Notably, and I'm sure we'll discuss this in the next hour at some point, John has been involved in the response to numerous high-profile crisis situations, including several airline accidents, the December 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami, and more recently advising companies affected by the invasion of Ukraine. In March 2014, John led a team advising Malaysian Airlines over the loss of flight MH370, a crisis which was unprecedented in aviation history. So there is no doubt we have a real expert with us here and we're delighted to have you join us. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Sophie.
So shall we start by going back in time? Let's go back 30 years to begin. How did you get into crisis management?
Okay, so I was originally a journalist. I was a journalist in the UK, in the US and in Singapore. And in 1994, I joined a PR company in Hong Kong. And it was a company which specialized in aviation clients. So we had Airbus, the aircraft manufacturer. They were our biggest client. And I ran that account across 8 markets in Asia. And then we had a whole clutch of airline clients, Air Canada, United, Lufthansa, Dragonair, which was at the time, was a large regional carrier based in Hong Kong. Mm-hmm. And because of the type of clients we handled, it seemed like barely a week went by. There wasn't some issue or some challenge or some incident we had to deal with. So that's kind of where I got started. But more relevantly, one of our clients became IATA, the International Air Transport Association, which is the trade body for the world's airlines. And they hired us, it was in 1995. And they were a great client to work with because they didn't keep us very busy. But the one thing they did do was they used to run conferences for aviation PR professionals in different parts of the world. So I used to look forward to getting these clients from the calls from the client in Geneva to say, John, are you free the first week in May? I don't know. It depends. What is it really? And he'd say, well, we're doing another conference. Okay, well, where is it this time? So Cape Town. Yeah, let me check the diary. Yeah, I think I'm free now. So I would go to these conferences. We in fact, were the only PR company they used. So we would always get invited. And so I would rock up to these conferences. I'd chair a panel or I'd do a presentation. But what quickly became apparent after the first 2 or 3 that I'd been to, the one subject that everybody in the room wanted to talk about was crisis management. Because the conferences were designed to allow professionals to exchange information and share thoughts on issues which were of common concern, and that was one. And the background, what was going on in the background there, what was kind of prompting these conversations was 2 things. One was the arrival of CNN and all the other 24-hour cable and satellite news channels, which brought with it risk that if you were an airline, you could have an accident in a far corner of the network, say in Cape Town or in Tokyo, and it could be playing out live on television to an international audience while you yourselves were just learning what had happened. And of course, nobody had thought of social media in those days, so which kind of accelerated that risk by a factor of 10. So that was one thing. The other thing was legislation. Because there had been a series of badly handled airline accidents, particularly in the US, legislation was brought in the United States first, which mandated airlines to have a family assistance program. It was known as the Aviation Family Assistance Act. And that was brought in 1996, initially for US airlines only, but then it spread to every other airline operating into the US. Well, that prompted a step change in crisis management preparedness for the airlines, because they now had to do it. And if you have to do it for the US, if you're British Airways, for example, you have to do it for your operations into the US. In fact, you have to do it for your whole network. So those two things were going on, and that family assistance legislation spread around the rest of the world. It went to the European Union, it popped up in Australia, Brazil, other jurisdictions around the world. So it's now become a standard for the entire industry. And so a lot of airlines were looking for help. How do we actually readdress our crisis planning? How do we deal with this new communication risk? And they were going to IATA and saying, look, we need help. IATA didn't have a mechanism to help them. So after one of these conferences, I said to the client of IATA, you should really set up a consultancy and help your airline members develop best practice. And he turned around to me and said, would you like to do that? So kind of the stars aligned. It was a chance or a series of coincidences, I would say. But that was how I got started. So I joined IATA in 1998 and was there for about 6 years. And the mission that we had was to kind of help the airline members develop and share best practice. And then because I was working with airlines, it was myself and the team, we were working in the airline industry. It was very high profile. Other industries would approach us, hotel groups would call us and say, if you're doing this for the airlines, can you come and do this for us too? Because we face very similar risks, different environment, of course, but many of the risks are very similar. The challenges they face are very similar in the event of mass fatalities. So that was where it all got started, probably more detailed than you wanted.
No.
That was how I got started and why I've had so much experience working with airlines in particular and with manufacturers.
Amazing. So you said about how you mainly have worked with airlines, but also hotel groups, and you touched upon that they would perhaps experience quite similar crisis, although in a different environment. Now, as someone who is not an expert in crisis management by any stretch, what are those similarities and differences? Like, are there some general principles for crisis management that apply across all industries, or does it always have to be very specific?
It's a very interesting question, actually. So if you look at hotel groups in particular, and they in fact were the first non-aviation clients to approach us, or non-aviation businesses, we think about it, hotels share pretty much the same customer base. How do people get to a hotel? Often they fly there to the destination. So it's pretty much the same customer base. It's very international. It's an absolutely global industry, and things can happen anywhere in the network. If you're a large hospitality group like an Accor or a Hilton, a Star Wars, for example, you have risks all around the world in every different market where you operate. And the other thing is, although the operating environment, the type of situations that you may run into are very different, some of the consequences are the same. So you may have loss of facilities, for example. You may have loss of life. You may have serious injuries, people displaced. People who've been inconvenienced or let down. And the one thing which all businesses have in common, they all face the same external environment. Going back 25 years, it was all about CNN and 24-hour cable and satellite TV news. Now it's all about social media and the fact that anyone's got a camera in their pocket. And if something happens, whatever that thing may be, they have the ability to photograph it or record it, live stream it. And so the world can learn about it if it's a really spectacular incident, while the company itself is only just learning as well. So that's what they have in common. But of course, the plans that you need to put in place are very different, and they're very specific to the type of business that you're dealing with.
So what would be an example of that, for example, in the hotel industry?
So with hotels, as I said, it's a global industry. So you need to be able to, first of all, be aware of what's happening in the far corners of your network and how that's playing out. So in today's environment, that means you need social listening, because the risk that hotels face, if we're going to stick with that example, is that something may happen at a hotel, for example, in Harbin in northern China. and it may be making news headlines around the world the next day, simply because there's a piece of video available. And that actually did happen for one of the clients that I work with, a big international hotel group. It was December the 26th. I can't remember the year, but I do remember it was Boxing Day. And I got a call from the client at head office in Geneva saying, "John, are you aware of this piece of video that's going viral in China?" And what the video showed was a chambermaid in a hotel in China cleaning mugs in a guest room with a toilet brush. And that piece of video went absolutely ballistic. It was a slow news day, but that story, first of all, spread right across China. Then it spread around Asia. I mean, it ended up with an op-ed piece in the Daily Telegraph in London. It ended up with pieces on Fox News in the United States. It was extraordinary, but a great example of how, a fairly, an unpleasant and unsavory event, but fairly innocuous in the scheme of things, because there's a piece of video and because it's shocking and disgusting in this case, it engages the human emotions, and that gives it virality. And so it spread everywhere. And the story would not die. It kept popping up. It popped up for months. So how do you deal with that? If you're a global hotel group based in Geneva, and this is happening at one of your hotels in China, how do you deal with it? Well, the first thing is to be aware of it, to know that it's actually happening, to have seen the same bit of video that everybody else has seen, and then to have a very clear action plan for how are we going to address it.
And how can people plan ahead for so many different types of crises that can occur? How can people plan for each one?
Well, you're absolutely right. How do you plan for such a wide spectrum of risks? I mean, if you are a hotel group, if you are an airline, if you're any kind of international business, there are so many things that can go wrong on any given day. But one of the mistakes that companies make, and I've actually seen examples of this, is they start building plans around specific risks that they run. Now, to be clear, you should have an overview of what are the most likely risks. What are the risks that are most likely to affect your business? So companies, will often have a risk register, and they'll assess and they'll score their risks. But when you start building plans around a specific risk, what you end up with is two things. One is multiple plans. So one particular company I work with is a global logistics company. They had a plan for an aircraft accident because they operated aircraft. They had another plan for an IT systems failure. They had yet another plan for a pandemic. They had another plan for a lockdown of premises because of an active shooter. So they had, in fact, when we looked at all the plans that they had across the entire business, they had 13 different crisis management plans. And if you laid them side by side on the table, they didn't even look the same. They didn't use the same terminology. They didn't use even the same design, the same fonts. So because they'd all been produced in isolation by different departments of the same company. So those plans were not linked up at all. They didn't talk to each other. But the other major problem, which is a very real one, is you could almost guarantee that the day that the bell rings, if you take that kind of approach, you can pretty much guarantee the day the bell rings and something really significant happens that has a major impact on your business, it will be the one thing you never considered and you don't have a plan for. And I'll give you an example. Back in, I think it's 2011, a volcano erupted in Iceland. Now, at the time, I was working with Changi Airport in Singapore. Now, I can tell you for a fact that in their risk register, the risk of a volcanic eruption in Iceland affecting Singapore Changi Airport scored so low that it had never even been considered, in fact, and there was certainly no plan to deal with that. But what happened was that volcanic eruption closed European airspace. So that immediately and indefinitely, by the way, we didn't know how long airspace would be closed. Now, the problem for Changi Airport and for every other airport around the periphery of Europe that handle a high percentage of transit passengers was that they now had passengers stranded who couldn't get home. So a very large percentage of Singapore Changi traffic is through traffic on the way from other parts of Asia or from Australasia back into Europe and the other way around. So what you had was business travelers who couldn't get home from their business trips. Probably more distressing and more difficult to deal with was the families who'd been on holiday and now couldn't go home. They were now stranded in hotels if they were lucky, but every hotel room in Singapore was blocked. People who'd been on holiday had maxed out their credit cards. So even if they could find a hotel room, they couldn't pay for it, or would have trouble paying for it, and meals and all the other expenses. There was no other way to get home. You couldn't take a bus if you were going back to Europe from Asia. So they were stranded. So for Changi Airport, what actually happened was they had rows and rows of hundreds of camp beds in the corridors at the airport to accommodate people who either couldn't get to a hotel or couldn't afford to stay long. And nobody knew how long this was going to go on. And you could replicate that scene in Bangkok, in Kuala Lumpur, in every other, as I said, every other airport around the periphery of Europe. So that was a very good example of why scenario-specific plans, have their limitations. So what you need to do is actually focus not on what might happen. You do need to have a view of that, but don't build plans around specific risks. Look instead at what are the consequences we may face, because the list of potential consequences is actually much shorter and it's much more predictable. And the fact is, if something happens that then brings consequences for you as a business, that thing has already happened. You can't turn the clock back and make it unhappen. So what you're actually dealing with is the consequences of that event. So in the case of Changi Airport, the consequence was massive disruptions to its passengers, demand for catering services, demand for accommodation in the corridors of the airport, and lots of flights that would normally be going through the airport couldn't go. So you build your plans around consequences, because the art of crisis management is really, it's all about managing consequences. So what are we dealing with? What's our plan for mitigating these consequences, making this bad situation a little bit better, and above all, not making it any worse? And how are we going to do that? That's what crisis management is really all about.
Okay, interesting. So it's more about the consequences rather than what might cause them to happen.
Yes.
So obviously it's 2023 when we're recording this, so it wouldn't be a webinar unless I asked you about the pandemic and COVID-19, and especially knowing how much that impacted. I mean, it impacted all industries, but especially the aviation industry and hotel industries. So, I mean, is this the sort of thing that people had included in their risk registers, or was it just so unlikely to happen that it hadn't occurred to people that all flights could be grounded, for example?
No, I think responsible businesses in the travel sector in particular had very much included this in their risk register. A pandemic had been forecast. And in fact, there had been precursors to it. You think back to the SARS epidemic outbreak in Asia back in the early 2000s, and 2003, which did not spread any further. In a sense, that it was a coronavirus, but it was so virulent, it actually killed its hosts so quickly that they couldn't spread it as widely as the COVID-19 virus was spread. So that was one thing. There's another one called MERS-CoV in the Middle East, which affected many countries, and I think resulted in about 1,000 deaths. Not as virulent as COVID, but another coronavirus. So it was absolutely on people's radar. What we couldn't have foreseen is just how severe the initial crisis would be, and then all the secondary crises that followed it. Because if you think about that, as it proliferated, it touched every segment of the economy in pretty much every country of the world. It touched pretty much every part of society all around the world. There are very few countries or portions of society or businesses that were completely untouched by COVID. So it really was a watershed event. It would be wrong to call it a black swan event because it was not unpredicted. But I think the extent of it and the scale of it and the duration of it probably took most people by surprise. So it has had a number of major effects, especially on the way in which companies think now about responding to crises. So if we kind of look at it, take a step back from it, what's actually happened? It's become a bit of a cliche to say that COVID in and of itself didn't really change anything for businesses and in society. What it did was it accelerated a lot of things that were already happening. So think about the generational shift in the workforce for a start. That's a normal process that happens anyway. But because of COVID, you have this phenomenon of the big retirement, where people who were possibly 10, 15 years away from retirement under normal circumstances decided, you know what, I'm out. Or the companies, you know, being forced to downsize and cut costs were getting rid of the most expensive part of the workforce, which are the older, more experienced people. So you had an accelerated retirement of people in their early to mid 50s and late 50s who in normal circumstances wouldn't have retired for another 5, 10 years or maybe longer. So that accelerated the departure from the workforce of a certain portion of the population. At the same time, you had the arrival of an entirely new demographic, which is Gen Z. And much as, you know, I'm wary about putting labels on groups of people just to describe when they were born, there is something different about Gen Z, which is largely people born around the turn of the millennium. So people who by now are in their early 20s, they are the first generation that grew up with social media. If you think about it, Facebook was launched in 2004. I think of Twitter in 2006. So much as millennials, the generation that preceded them, you know, got to grips with social media in their teens and early adulthood, Gen Z have had this since they were growing up. So they've never known a world that didn't have Twitter, did not have TikTok, did not have, well, Facebook is more of a platform for people like me, I think, but TikTok and Snapchat and all these other platforms. So that's what's different about it. So you've had a change in the workforce. Younger people, millennials and Gen Zs in particular, because largely of the formative experiences that they've had growing up, you know, they grew into a world that had been changed by 9/11. Then you had the endless wars that followed that. Then you had the global financial crisis in 2008, the effects of which we're still living with today. Then you had the rise of right-wing populism in parts of Europe, across Europe, UK, United States, Latin America, right-wing nationalism. And then, of course, you had the war in Ukraine. And in the middle of all that, you've had COVID. So it's been an era of, you know, what has become known as perma-crisis. And so the values of the outlook of that generation, that younger cohort, you know, the people in now in their late teens and early adulthood, is quite different from the generation that went before them, let alone people of my generation. So not surprisingly, their outlook is different. Their values are different. The way they judge companies and individuals is different. The other thing that's happened is there's been massive social changes, you know, the acceptance of same-sex relationships, same-sex marriages, the increasing diversity in the workforce, you know, ethnic diversity, cultural diversity, ethnic diversity, gender diversity. All of these things, you know, the young generation have grown up with and now taken their stride. So you've seen all of those things playing into a different worldview. And that's relevant to companies and to individual leaders in times of crisis, because they absolutely will be judged. There is a war for talent. Again, that's not anything particularly new, but there is a lot of research that shows for Gen Zs in particular, millennials as well to some extent, but especially for Gen Zs, they are, first of all, more likely to pay a premium for products or services from companies that come from companies or brands whose values align with theirs. So they, in other words, it's not just enough to try to sell me your shiny new smartphone, which is a marginal upgrade on one I already have. They want to know who's selling it to me. What does this company, what does this brand stand for? And am I comfortable with those values? That's one thing. The second thing is, in terms of employer branding, again, there's a lot of research that shows that Gen Zs in particular are going to be very selective and picky about who they want to work for. So they are they are overwhelmingly more likely to want to work for a company whose values they agree with and whose values align with theirs. But importantly, it's not a one-time deal, because they continue to judge. So having made the decision that I'm going to join your organization, now they're on the inside, they're going to be watching and learning and judging. You know, what kind of company really is this? What lies behind the facade? Are the people who lead this company people that I trust, that I feel comfortable with, whose values reflect mine? And so when things go wrong in times of crisis, you've got a very judgmental audience, or not an audience, but a series of audiences out there, both external and internal. So it's arguably even more important that you're seen to be doing the right thing. When things go wrong, that you have a plan to address it, and that you're doing the right thing, and you're saying what you're doing. and there's no gap between what you're saying and what you're doing. So I don't know if that's probably a long-winded answer, but that's
great.
Companies have changed during COVID. And one other point to make, of course, is a lot of companies downsized significantly during COVID, and they're only now just rebuilding. And part of the downsizing and cost cutting and the focus on survival meant that they were not focused as much on crisis planning and training and running exercises. And also the new people who come into the businesses were not there for the last crisis. So their memories don't go beyond, pre-COVID. So if you were in a hotel group that had a major crisis in, let's say, the mid-2000s, 2010, 2012, the people who are there today weren't there at the time. So they don't have that institutional memory and that experience. And the same is true, I think, of airlines. So people who had the experience of living through previous crises are now, very often, they've left the building. So it is a different environment. And I'm seeing that very often now when I go and visit companies, not just airlines, but other companies as well. We're seeing a lot of new faces, and there's been a very obvious turnover, generational turnover, and a loss of experience in terms of crisis management.
Oh, wow. And do you see that as being a problem in the long term, so say the next 5 or 10 years, to fill that knowledge gap and that experience gap?
Well, the thing is that, experience comes with over time. People build up that experience. So, people who've just joined an airline communication department today, for example, or the communication team of a big company, 5 years from now, there'll be 5 years more experience under their belt. They will have dealt with different issues, and they will have gained that seasoning. But I was with a client, an airline, a big airline in the Middle East, about 3 weeks ago. And they told me they had lost 1/3. I mean, it's a very large airline in the Middle East. They had lost 1/3 of their communication team during COVID, and they were now rebuilding. And I met 3 of the new people who joined. None of them had previous airline experience. None of them had crisis management experience. I mean, they were learning. They're very keen to learn, and they're learning on the job. But it is something that takes time to build up that kind of that body of experience and institutional memory again.
So while we're talking about Gen Z and people new in the industry, I know we have some students who will be watching this. What advice would you give to them as they start out in the industry, whether they're still students or they're just entering into that world of crisis management?
Well, actually, strange enough, I'm talking to a class full of students tomorrow at the École Hôtelière de Lausanne, EHL, which is probably the world's best-known hotel school. So I've been a guest lecturer there for a while now, and I always find it fascinating to meet them, because you're talking to people who've got a very different worldview, and they always ask me questions I've never heard before, and it kind of keeps you on your toes. But what would I say to them? Number one is there's tremendous opportunities out there. It's a very exciting field. The field of communications right now is going through probably more significant change than it ever has. You think about the introduction of artificial intelligence, for example, ChatGPT, which is now, I think 2 days ago, GPT-4 was version 4 was released. So the technology is developing almost at warp speed, and that is having a direct impact on the practice of public relations, very, very, very direct. So there's new challenges emerging, there's new tools available to you, but the field is wide open. It is changing so quickly. So it's a tremendously exciting time to be coming into the practice of communication. The other thing I would say, and I used to get this a lot when I had a PR agency in Singapore, and we had a regular flow of interns who would come through, and I'd always try and talk to them because I was always interested in what motivated them and what they wanted to do in their careers. And often they'd say to me, probably just because they thought it was what I wanted to hear, I'm really interested in crisis management. How can I learn about crisis management? And the answer is, well, don't specialize too soon. When, crisis management is, to me, the most fascinating and the most testing part of communication practice. But you do need experience behind you. You need the ability. You need a lot of tools in your toolkit, and you need to know how to use them. And that only comes with experience. So I would say to those interns that we would see coming into the agency, spend some time doing brand PR, spend some time doing events, spend some time doing corporate. In other words, get a good grounding, and then you'll find that you will naturally gravitate towards one particular area of practice that really appeals to you, that you find challenging, and that allows you to express your what you feel you're best at. And it won't happen overnight. So be patient. Everything starts with those foundational skills. So expose yourself to as many different parts of the practice as you can. The other thing is it better to be in agency life or in-house? It depends. It depends on who you are. I've never worked actually in-house. I've always, even when I was at IATA, I had a consultancy business. It was a franchise agreement with IATA. So I've never worked for a big corporate. I've worked a lot, for very, very many big corporates, but I've never been part of the corporate team. And I understand the motivation of people who are part of a big business. They want to contribute, to the direction of a large business. Agencies, they typically attract a different type. We're more kind of hunter-gatherers. The thrill is in the chasing down a piece of business, winning it, and then executing on it, and seeing the client happy, and then seeing what else we can do for them. And the other thing is the variety. If you join a busy agency, 1 minute you're dealing with a petrochemical company, then a pharmaceutical company, then you're dealing with a big brand event. It's you're launching a new car model. It's very, very varied, and so that's what I personally enjoyed, and that's what I think draws people to agencies. And again, agencies have the advantage of working with many clients from many different industries, and you pick up and you learn. Nobody's got a monopoly on wisdom or the best way to do something. So you learn from all the clients that you work with, and then you bring that knowledge and experience to bear on the next client that you work for. And that's the value of agencies, really.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. And while we're talking about your consulting business, you've worked with obviously a wide variety of clients. What has been one of the most interesting clients or incidents that you've worked with clients on? Obviously that you can talk about. Don't want you breaking any NDAs.
Yeah. Yes. Unfortunately, some things you can't talk about in the public domain. I mean, I've been very fortunate to get involved in a variety of different things. I mean, the tsunami in 2004, I was there in Phuket for 3 months, acting as advisor on the team that was helping to identify and return the victims, and we were managing all the communications with the media, with the families, etc. around that. That was very, very, very testing. But again, a great learning experience, not one I would care to go through again, but it was fascinating. Malaysian Airlines MH370, we'll spend the rest of the session talking about that. And of course, the 9th anniversary of that was just last week, and the new Netflix documentary has come out, which I haven't had time to read yet. I'd be surprised if it tells us everything we don't already know. But nonetheless, it was a very high profile, very, very challenging environment. They were working directly with the CEO, the senior executives, the chairman, and it was, again, a very high pressure situation. But probably the most fun thing I've done recently, and the client I probably enjoy working with the most at the moment, I have to be careful how I say this, is UEFA, which is the governing body of European football. I've been engaged one way or another with UEFA for about 10 or 12 years now. And they keep throwing different assignments at me. One of them is UEFA runs a number of training programs, actually master's degree courses in sports governance. One which is called MESCO, which is a Masters in European Sports Governance, is designed for people who already work in sports federations. It's backed by a number of European universities, so it's academically very rigorous. And I teach a module on crisis communications on that course. And I've been doing that. I've done about 6 of those, I think. And that's fascinating. But then they said to me about 2 months ago, that thing that you do with MESCO, we've got another program very similar, but it's for former international footballers. And it's people who are coming to the end of their playing career and now want a career in sports governance. So they want to be the president of the Football Federation or sporting director of a major club, for example, and they don't have the academic framework and background to do that because they've been footballers. So it is a master's degree. It's an executive master's. run by UEFA, backed up by several universities. But the qualification, because many of these guys don't have, and women in fact, don't have a strong academic background, the qualification is you have to have played football at international level for your country, full international, or you have to have represented your club in a UEFA tournament like Champions League. This was, I was involved in the second, we call MIP, Masters for International Players, the second MIP program that had run. And it was about a month ago in London. And so I had 23 of these former international footballers, several of whom are, if you like football, are frankly household names. And it was fascinating dealing with them because they were very curious and really wanted to know about communication, marketing, about crisis management. So the challenge there, the reason it's so much fun is the challenge there is to take what you've learned working with other industries, airlines, for example, or hotel groups or manufacturing companies, and make it relevant to them. So that was fascinating, and I had some great conversations with some of them afterwards. One former England international, who I won't mention, he came to me at the end and he said, "What do you actually do?" You may well wonder that. I think my wife asks me that question quite often. And then we had a fascinating conversation about something that he'd been involved in. So it is all about taking the knowledge, because one of the things that I kind of learned along the way, it doesn't really matter what area of business you're in, what industry sector, what area of activity you're in. Some fundamental principles still apply. So your risk factors are different, the type of situations you may run into are different, but there are certain fundamental principles which apply universally, and that's what makes it interesting and fun to deal with all these different companies and to get that stimulation from it. So that's very rewarding.
Yeah, it sounds like you meet so many different types of people as well. What would you say is the most important step in crisis management? So you talk about how the principles are largely very similar, if not the same. So what would you say is the most important step in preparing a crisis management plan?
Well, the first thing is, you do need to have a risk register. You need to be aware of what risks you may run, but don't focus only on those, because, as we said, there may be something else that you hadn't thought of. So look at the risks that you run. But the most important thing of all is focus on the human impact. It's always, crisis management is always first and foremost about people. The people who are actually affected by whatever it is that happened, and what was the harm done to them? Is it just that they were inconvenienced, annoyed, upset, disappointed in you, let down, displaced? Or in more serious cases, was it the fact there was loss of life or serious injury? So focus on the harm done and calibrate your response to that. So how are you going to make that better for the people who were directly affected? Whether it was a customer who bought a product that went wrong or had to be recalled, or somebody who lost money because a bank collapsed, or is it somebody who lost a loved one because a train has crashed or a ferry has sunk? So you look at the actual harm done and calibrate and focus your response on that. The second thing is you need to be able to react quickly. And for that, planning is absolutely essential. Who's going to be involved? Who are the key decision makers we need to get in the room? And what are their roles and responsibilities? So you need to be able to do that quickly, have the key decision makers together. And that group, the crisis management committee or the crisis management team, that gathers, must involve communications, because communication is absolutely fundamental to the success of any crisis response. Because it's not just what you do or what you intend to do, it's how you're going to communicate that to all the people affected, both internally and externally. How are you going to maintain trust? How are you going to protect and defend your reputation and show people that actually, despite what just happened, which may have been horrendous, this is still a good company, we're still good people, and we're going to try to do the right thing. So that's really the essence of crisis management.
As you're talking, I'm realizing that it's so multi-layered, what you do and like what crisis management is. And I can imagine actually many of those situations, especially the more extreme crises that happen, that it's quite emotionally taxing for everybody involved. And how do companies balance that? Like, ultimately, they're all people. And for example, if we talk about MH370, then that will have affected everybody. It's a very, very sad thing to have happened. How do people tend to balance that emotional connection with then having to get into that business frame of mind of how do we now manage this from a reputation point of view?
Yeah, actually, that's an excellent question, because you're right. These situations can be very emotionally stressful for everybody involved, including outside consultants like us who go in to help. So part of our role is that we're not, when an airline like Malaysia Airlines in 2014 brought us in as advisors. One of the reasons, well, two things. One is we've seen it before, so we have an idea of how this might play out and what the challenges you're going to be facing. Secondly, we're not emotionally involved. These weren't our friends, our colleagues, our passengers. But nonetheless, when you're in the bunker, as it were, it's almost impossible not to get emotionally involved, because you see people, in a very, very testing, very challenging situation. But you have to try to distance yourself to some extent. So it is. I mean, one truism of major crises like MH370, and of course there have been many other airline accidents and disasters, is that people forget the airline itself is a victim. And much as, yes, of course, everyone's focused on the passengers who are on board the aircraft and their loved ones, people forget you're dealing with your own colleagues, your own friends. So the chairman of the Malaysia Airlines Crisis Management Committee, who was at the time the senior vice president of operations, and today is the CEO of Malaysia Airlines, in fact, a super guy, Captain Izan. He went through cadet school with Captain Sahari, the captain of MH370. It was one of his closest friends. So he had to put to one side his personal shock and disbelief over what had happened, and indeed his personal grief, and deal with and focus on the professional challenges. How do we get through this? And how do we make sure that we're doing the right things and we're saying the right things? And of course, that was a very, very challenging situation. And of course, people now remember or tend to refer to it as a badly handled crisis. And when I hear that, I always say the same thing. By who, actually? Because if you remember, who controlled the narrative around MH370? Who was running the daily press briefings? Who was making all the big decisions? In fact, it was not Malaysia Airlines, it was the government of Malaysia. And so one of the big challenges, one of many challenges the airline had, is it had very little leverage or control over what the government of Malaysia was saying and doing. But of course, they're a government-owned airline. So it's very difficult in that situation. And this is not unique to Malaysia. So I think if that situation had happened, for example, to a Chinese airline operating to Malaysia, it probably would have gone very similarly. Or an airline, pick a place in the world where you have government-controlled airlines and governments insisting on getting involved in the response to the detriment of the airline. So it was very challenging. But yes, you're right. So self-care, I mean, just to wrap up on that point, self-care is incredibly important. And sometimes you yourself, in the bunker, in the heat of the moment, when you're tired and you're running on fumes, you can't recognize yourself what a toll it's taking on you. It happened to me. So you've got to have people around you who are watching out for each other and are saying, you need to get some rest. We need to pull you back from this. I mean, I've been on a number of deployments, such as the tsunami, where you're exposed to very, very challenging situations. And in those cases, it's mandatory that if you volunteer, you put your hand up to go on the response, a condition of going is you must have a debrief with a trained mental health professional before you go home. Because it is a truism of crisis deployments that they leave a mark on you. You come back a slightly different person because you've seen things and learned things that you didn't know before. Now you might say that, well, isn't that part of gaining professional experience? Yes, it is. But it does leave a mark on you. And so you need to be aware of some of the danger signs and the way in which the things that you've learned and seen may impact you. So self-care is incredibly important, and responsible crisis management organizations take very good care of their people because they're going to need them again. And in the end, the only person you're really indispensable to is your family. So, you need to send your people home to their families and not have, secondary crises after the event.
That's actually really interesting. Good to know that there's those facilities and resources out there for crisis comms and crisis management professionals. Because I can only imagine the situations that you've been put in. We have had a question come through related to MH370, which actually really links with what you just said as well. So the question is, how do you think Malaysia Airlines dealt with MH370? So already that ties in with what you said about the government, actually.
Yeah, well, if you think about it, they were in an absolutely impossible situation and in reality, an unprecedented situation. Aircraft had gone missing. Nobody knew where it was. So there was very little information available. All we know is it took off and then it disappeared. We don't know where it is. We don't know the status of any of the people on board the aircraft. So the first currency that you have in a crisis is information, and we didn't have that. And of course, everyone's blaming the company whose name is on the side of the airplane, who sold the ticket to the passenger or the family member who boarded the aircraft. It's a very easy thing to do, and it's a very natural thing to do. But as I said, the biggest problem that they had was the involvement of the government of Malaysia. So when I arrived in Kuala Lumpur, which was about 3 days in, and I had my first conversation with the CEO, it was a guy called AJ Yaya. And AJ said, what do you suggest we should do now? The question rather took me aback, because you were in the middle of the world's biggest news story, and why are you looking at me and asking me what to do? But nonetheless, that's where you fall back on your knowledge and your training. And so I said to him, look, AJ, the first thing is ignore the noise. This story is running wall to wall on CNN and every other major international news outlet, almost without pause. And there's nothing new to report. So they're having to report on something. And so we keep seeing stories of the day. Today, the story is about 2 passengers who appear to have fake passports. Yesterday, the story was about the picture emerging of the first officer posing for a picture in the cockpit with 2 young women. So was there a breach in security? There'll be another story tomorrow. We don't know what it is, but there definitely will be another one until the aircraft is found. So stop reacting to the story of the day, because all you're doing is reading it. So what you have to try to do, and this is advice that holds true in pretty much any major crisis, try as much as you can to ignore the noise and focus on what do you own as a responsibility. You, Malaysia Airlines, what do you own? And what they owned as a responsibility was the care of the families of the people on board, not just the passengers, of their own employees as well. So focus on that, make sure all your messaging is about that. And in fact, that's exactly what they were doing. But the problem was that was not the narrative that was playing in the media, because who did we see on the podium at the press conferences every day? The Minister of Transport, the Chief of the Armed Services, the Chief of the Air Force, the Chief of the Navy, the Director of Civil Aviation, and the CEO of Malaysia Airlines basically had a non-speaking stand-on part, walk-on part rather, standing at the end of the row of people with nothing to say. So because he had no information. So it was very, very challenging. I'm not saying for a moment that everything that they did went right. There were mistakes made, as there always are. But it was in a very highly charged situation over which they had, unfortunately, virtually no control.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, extremely hard situation. I have just a couple more questions, then we have one more from the audience as well. So I'll try and be quick with mine. So on a slight decourse, really, from examples. So you're the author of the book, Best Practice Guidelines of Crisis Communication and Reputation Management in the Digital Age, which is published by IATA, which leads me on to, how can people make their crisis communication fit for purpose in the age of digital media? So you spoke about the rise of CNN and 24-hour news, and then how social media means suddenly everyone's a journalist. How can people cope with that?
Yeah, actually, it's not a book. It's a set of guidelines which IATA publishes, and it's ongoing. So the first edition was published in 2012, and we've updated it every 2 years since then, because the environment keeps changing and social media keeps developing and morphing and getting the speed of the technology keeps getting better and better. So in fact, I'm working on the draft of the 2023 edition right now. In fact, I'm overdue sending back, I've submitted the first. I've got to work on some suggestions from IATA, but I've committed to get that to them in the next week or so. So the 2023 edition will be published in probably in about May of this year, and it'll be amplified along. IATA will make sure that everyone's aware of it. But to answer your question, the whole purpose of this is to help. It's a guide to planning. So if you don't already have a crisis communication plan, though most airlines do, or if you're worried that it may not be fit for purpose anymore, it's a guide to help you think about some of the challenges you're going to face and how you would address them. For example, how are you going to deal with the issue of video coming live from one of your aircraft showing an onboard emergency? Which actually we predicted was going to happen, and then eventually did happen with Southwest Airlines, with a passenger streaming live on Facebook. And actually, that phenomenon went to its kind of ultimate conclusion about a month ago, where a passenger on an aircraft in Nepal was streaming live on Facebook as the aircraft hit the ground. So if you want to know what it's like to be in a plane crash from the point of view of the passenger, look at that video. It's pretty horrific. Nobody survived that crash, including the person who took the video. But he was streaming live to his Facebook account as the aircraft went down. So it's, how would you deal with that? Well, the answer is social listening. You can't deal with it if you're not aware that it's happening. So you need a social listening tool or an agency who can alert you, so you know that this video is out there, or that these pictures are being circulated, because you can't respond to something you haven't seen. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, how would you use your own online channels? So your own website, your own employee engagement channel, for example, if you have one, your own Twitter, your Facebook, Instagram, etc. How would you mobilize those channels in a real crisis where there may have been loss of life, for example, and making sure you're consistent across all of those touch points, both online and offline, both in terms of the tone and content of the messaging you're putting out there, but then also the branding. So what do people see? In other words, what do people see? If they come to your website or they go to your Facebook page, what you don't want them to see, if there's just been an accident where there's loss of life, you don't want them to see smiling faces, lots of bright colors, promotional messaging. So these are all things, if you want to change that quickly, you need to plan it in advance. So that's what this document does. It guides you through, if you're a communication professional, guides you through all those different challenges and tries to just get you to focus on how you would do this. And hopefully we're helping companies. And by the way, it's not just, it's for the aviation industry, but I've seen it used in hotel groups. IATA keeps a record of, or can identify other companies' servers that download it. So, and they're quite happy about that. Perfectly happy for other industries to take it, look at it, and then adapt some of the principles to their own situation.
Mm-hmm. We'll have to add the link to it in our course, John. So for anybody who's listening who doesn't know, VirtualSpeech and John and our partners at Crisis VR have worked together on a crisis communications course that's focused on the airline industry. So there's something else we can link to from that course. And I mean, from your point of view, when we were creating that course, what do you see as the benefit of using virtual reality or simulations in training for something like crisis management?
Well, that product that we put together, that platform, essentially it's an e-learning platform. And the virtual reality, the VR part of it is kind of extra sizzle, which has a value, but essentially it's an e-learning platform. And the reason that the partners in Crisis VR, myself, Jerry Allen, Tom Garner, one or two others, Dom, and you, the reason we thought there would be a need for this is because we could see that the days when airlines or hotel groups or any big business would fly consultants all around the world to deliver training at the front line in person were coming to an end. We could see that. Now, I spent 15 years of my career pretty much flying around the world on Lufthansa, training all their frontline managers in all the stations they operate to outside Germany, which was very rewarding and lots of fun, but also very expensive for the client. And those days, they just don't do that anymore. They won't. And that was even before COVID came along. Of course, COVID has put an absolute hard stop on all of that. So there was obviously a need to deliver those people at the front line, whether they're hotel GMs, airline station managers, people at the front line in any big business who are in a geographically dispersed workforce. They obviously still need training. So the question is, how do you deliver it to them and at scale and at relatively low cost? So e-learning is the answer. The advantage of the virtual reality element is it provides an immersive experience. So if you're training somebody how to deal with an ambush at the airport, for example, well, you can set up the scenario, then put on a VR headset, and suddenly you're in that ambush. You can see the people in front of you. You can hear the questions. You can feel your heart rate start to go up, and your palms getting sweaty, or a press briefing, or a briefing to families, for example. Yes, it is a virtual environment, but the technology is advancing very quickly. And so the visuals, the graphics are getting more and more realistic. Mm-hmm. Project forward 5 years, it's going to be super realistic. So it does add that immersive element, but at heart, it's an e-learning platform to deliver content at scale, training content at scale to a dispersed audience is really what it is.
Mm-hmm. I love that phrase that VR is the sizzle, not the point. And with that media ambush scene, we do have one in the course where somebody's coming out of an elevator and they're ambushed by the media. And we actually have people who aren't looking for crisis management training, but they will try out that environment. And I can always tell when somebody's currently doing it because I see them move away like that because there's one of the journalists that's right next to them. Final question, and it's one from the audience. How do you prepare for a crisis when you don't know what it will be with how fast the world is changing these days, such as with the rise of AI and different environmental factors as well?
Yeah, well, again, preparation is the key. So it's looking at the full spectrum of risks that you may face, your organization, your business may face, but then also having an open mind as to there may be something that comes completely out of left field that may impact your business dramatically, but you hadn't really considered it. So you've got to keep an open eye. But without plans and preparation, you're going to be lost. Now, what I always say about plans is they can't do your thinking for you, but they can help you structure your thinking and organize yourself, especially in those critical first few hours when everyone's running around with their hair on fire, if they have any. And the roof is falling in, and you need some structure, you need some order, you need to be able to sit down and think clearly. And so the advantage of a crisis plan, it will help you do that, but it won't do your thinking for you. So it might prompt you to ask certain questions or to think about certain issues, but in the end, you're going to rely on your professional experience, your professional judgment, because the plan's not going to tell you how to do that. So it is important to do planning. It's also important to do training so that you're familiarizing yourself with the kind of situations you might face, and effectively you're rehearsing it. As I say, the body can't really go where the mind hasn't been already. So you need to train for those situations and run exercises. And exercises don't have to be very elaborate. You can do fairly simple notification exercises. Can we meet it? Can we reach everybody? And where are they right now? If the bell rings right now, how many of our key decision makers could we actually reach? Exercise it, test it. Don't do it during 9 to 5, do it at the weekends, in the evenings. You won't be thanked for it, but it's a much more realistic idea of, are you really ready for this? And then you can build up the type of exercises you do to make them more realistic, more immersive, more stressful. And if you exercise hard, you should, in theory at least, be able to play a bit easier.
Great. Thank you very much, John. So I'm conscious of time and we've been running for an hour. So finally, how can people reach you or learn more?
Well, I don't know if you're going to put a link to my contact details on the recording of this on YouTube, but simply you can find me on LinkedIn. Just look for John Bailey plus Go Crisis or plus Crisis Management. I tend to pop up. My email address is john@gocrisis.com. So john@gocrisis.com. I'm always happy to hear from people who've got questions or ideas. And I hope I do hear from some of you. I'm always disappointed if nobody ever gets in touch. So please connect with me. And I'm always happy if I can, especially students. I've spent quite a lot of time helping students with dissertations, etc., or just people who've got questions about how to approach this.
I know that I will certainly be sending the recording to my dad, who may have questions. So there's one person who might contact you, John. So thank you so much for joining us this evening, John, and everybody who tuned in. I'm sure we'd all agree that we've had a really interesting conversation. So if anyone watching or listening wants to learn more, we will add John's LinkedIn profile to the recording on YouTube, as well as John's email address, if he's happy for us to do that as well. So thank you very much, everybody, and have a good evening. Thank you, John.
Thanks, Sophie.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.